Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent is what drives our interpretation.
Yep. Where have we been so far?
Oh my. So we've been focusing on the Canon, and we've talked about the Torah, we've talked about most recently, we started talking about the writings.
Yep, this fuzzy group of writings that we have at the end of our Bibles that, it seems like that boundary that we have in the Hebrew Bible of the group of the writings is a little more blurry than what we typically think of. So last week I gave quite a bit of, high-level data on just the writings, what they are, how we should think about them, and so I didn't get to everything. I told you I wanted to bring Nate back and we talk about this a little more, so that's what we're going to do this week to wrap up some different issues that I didn't address last week as pertains to the writings. And then we'll move on to the question of, do we have the right version of the Old Testament, which is going to bring in some text critical issues. I don't want to spend too long on that because that's getting a little bit far afield from the canon, but it does relate, so we have to talk about it. So anyway, with that, Nate, you got any questions? Any thoughts?
Well, I think as we go through this, we'll have lots of questions. Very interesting topic for sure. So the first question I want to ask you is, what if we just don't read Esther? Are we going to miss any kind of doctrine?
Yeah. So, and what you're referring to is, Esther and Song of Solomon or Song of Songs and...
Yeah, the controversial ones.
Yeah, and Ecclesiastes. Those
right.
are all... There was some question in the Council of Jamnia in 90 CE about these books. Should they be in the canon? And so... we don't know for sure. They weren't quoted in the New Testament to say they were. It seems like in the early canon lists, all the ones that we really have besides Jamnia, they were accepted. It seems like they were, again, widely accepted as part of the authoritative collection of writings. However, what if you disagree with that? Or what if someone you know disagrees with that? Are we going to miss out on doctrine? Now, first of all, we should read these books. I think they're good. We can talk about why in a minute. What contribution do they make to the canon? But are we going to miss doctrine if we don't read the writings? Or if we don't read if you take the Apocrypha as being canonical, as being authoritative, what if, we Protestants over here, we're not reading the Apocrypha canonically or as authoritative, so are we going to miss out on doctrine? And the answer is, well, where does the writings and everything else that is canonical derive its authority and its meaning from?
The Torah.
The Torah. And so I still advocate that everything that we need is in the Torah, and everything after that is an outworking of what is already there in a new context, new genres, and so on.
Okay, now I've heard it said that some of the Catholic doctrines that differ, that are distinct, come from the Apocrypha. Purgatory, for example.
Yeah, there are some texts that have, and whether or not they're interpreted correctly, that's a matter of debate.
Right.
But there are some places in the Apocrypha that are used to prop up certain Catholic ideas that we Protestants don't agree with.
Right.
And so here's the thing. If you find something, like I said last week, if you find something in the Apocrypha that you cannot find somewhere in the Torah, the prophets, and the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, then you've misinterpreted it, or it's not a book that, maybe that's the reason why it was not considered authoritative by a lot of the early Jewish and Christian community.
Right.
And with that, I feel like it's good to bring up, there's not just a list of doctrine that the early Jews or Christians had to say, okay, this has all this doctrine, it's in the canon. This one has some extra doctrine or is missing this doctrine, it's out of the canon. It may have been doctrinal, and in some cases it definitely was. We can see that, especially as we get into the New Testament. But it may have also been that it doesn't really accord with the story or add to it in the way that, in the same thrust and tone of the Torah. That could be something as well. Just not that I've taken a deep dive into the book of Maccabees. I've read it a couple times, but there is this note at the end of the book that it just pushes the story forward into God's future salvation and continued commitment to Israel. And so that's a good scriptural theme, but the book is so heavily focused on the Maccabees. Perhaps it could be that the early community was like, well, this is not a story that is focusing us as much as it should be on the promises and faithfulness of God that we find to Abraham, Moses, and so on. So it could be doctrinal issues. It could also be story issues, things like that.
Okay, so let me ask you another question. So I know a lot of people talk about progressive revelation. And do you see within the canon doctrines developing past the Torah?
No.
No, not at all. Just
End of podcast.
end of podcast.
Okay.
Drop the mic.
So, like, I think the one that's hit up on a lot is the idea of resurrection. You get, some clear notes of that in Isaiah. It definitely shows up in Daniel, and people will say that doesn't show up in the Torah, especially if you are kind of on the source critical path, you'll be predisposed to that idea. If you've listened through this podcast, if you've read through the waters, I think that resurrection, for instance, shows up very clearly in the typology of Genesis. So it's not a new idea. It's just finally expressed more clearly in Isaiah and Daniel. And Isaiah also, we've already talked about that. That's part of the same corpus of the Torah, prophets, and Psalms. So kind of all goes together anyway. So who cares as far as when that developed in that corpus, because it's all kind of one unit. So with that, no, I think that, yes, the Torah is more complex to interpret all this doctrine out of. There's also later books that are a little more clear on this. They have read the Torah. They are the tree planted by waters that's continually meditating on Torah. They understand it inside and out and can make these things more explicit for us. And that's why it's helpful to read the writings and things like that. But no, I think that all the doctrine, all the hopes that you find in the writings are going to be already present in the prophets and the Torah. So all that to say, like, if you don't, that it goes back to your earlier question. Like, if you find someone who doesn't read some of the later books, again, I would challenge them and ask why, but they're not going to miss out on anything.
Okay. So, well, at least there's not a new doctrine that's being told. So what you're saying is, like, there's no new doctrines in the prophets or the writings, but the doctrines that are initially given to us in the Torah may be expounded upon, clarified, and so that there is a sense of progressive revelation in that sense.
Well, and I think even the term doctrine, like we think we're Baptists, we're post-Reformation, we think in terms of doctrine, and yes, we do have like essential truths and doctrines. There were doctrines back then, but it's more about the hopes and promises and consistency of God and His character, those kinds of things. Which, yes, you could label those as doctrines, but it's broader than doctrine. It's worldview. It's
I wonder when the first systematic theology book came out.
Philo?
I don't know. Is it?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm sure there's some pseudepigrapha I'm missing, but anyway. Yeah, maybe Philo. So anyway, I just want to say that to emphasize that sometimes we may be looking for the wrong things as we're reading, but it's showing, again, the hopes and the promises that God made in the Torah being expressed in later situations, just like in Esther, for instance. The contribution that makes to the canon is, unlike the book of Maccabees, which is focused so heavily on the Maccabees, we get this central statement from Mordecai that says, like, look, Esther, if you don't go and act to save us, God will raise up somebody else. We're going to die now, but God will raise up somebody else and save us later. And so the focus is all on God's giving exodus to His people. And that's what happens at the end of the book. And Esther plays a role in being God's instrument to do that. And so, again, you see God's covenant faithfulness in this new setting, pointing us forward to the final exodus that we're still waiting for. And so that's the contribution that it makes, and why it is a book that points us to the hopes and the tradition and the consistency of God found in the Torah and the prophets.
Right. And we could go through each one of the controversial books and do the same thing.
Well, I mean, every book of the writings, and I think that'd be, at some point a good exercise to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What about the order of the writings?
Okay.
Is there significance there?
Yeah, so maybe. There's a lot of debate about that. So Sailhammer, he points to the fact that he thinks based on the canon lists and the narrative weight that the books carry, he thinks that Ezra and Nehemiah as one book unit is the final book, or Chronicles is the final book. Now, if these books were not crafted with some sort of literary unity, such as the Torah, prophets, and Psalms exhibit, how weighty is the order? To me, I don't think that there is a massive. I don't think there's a massive significance to the order. I think the Psalms are kind of possibly their own unit due to that tripartite structure of Torah, prophets, and Psalms. Then after that, you have all the writings, and really you can pick up and read them at any point and understand them by themselves. With that, I will say there's been some really good articles. This goes back and forth between like G.K. Beale, Peter Shields, Stephen Dempster. They've all written articles on this, and there's just a lot of debate around what's the end of the writings. I do think there's a good case to be made for the fact that First and Second Chronicles is meant to be. It was written by the author of that book to be understood as a kind of a capstone to the story found in the Torah and prophets. Yeah, because it takes the whole biblical story and reinterprets it in a way where you're left in Kings with this like, oh, Israel screwed up and we're in this just terrible exile waiting for God's promises. And Chronicles takes that and reframes the same story in a way that causes you to look forward to, yes, we're in this exile, but Cyrus said go home, so God's still being faithful, so something else is going to happen. So it's the same story with a different framing, and I think that that book is intended to be kind of a capstone to the story by the author, but that doesn't mean that someone sat down and crafted this and said, these books are in this order.
Yeah, and that makes sense, and that goes, I think, with just the pattern of Scripture in general.
Yeah.
Even we were looking at this the Book of Psalms last night in our missional community, and just how that's arranged. The first few books of there's 5 books in the Book of Psalms, and they're arranged that you have all these laments at the beginning, and then towards the end there's all this hope, and it seems like there's this pattern throughout Scripture. Even the Book of Genesis, when we were going through the Book of Genesis, I mean, the first part of Genesis is like the world's going down into a pit, and then the second half, really the second, I'd say 2/3 of Genesis, more than half of Genesis, is a story of hope.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of where you get a lot of the debate as well, because you have the hope of Chronicles, I think, and you also have the pessimism of Ezra and Nehemiah, where it shows they screw up again. So the debate really comes in with, should our Bibles end on a note of pessimism or should our Bibles end on a note of hope? And it's like, well, you can read them independently, and they each have their own individual message, I think. So I'm not too hung up on the order. I do think they are good to read together, because you see in Ezra and Nehemiah, like, yeah, we're never going to pull this off, are we? And then you get Chronicles, and it's like, well, God is still faithful. He's still working towards this. So anyway, is there an order to their writings? I don't really know. I don't think we should care. Yeah.
Right.
And a lot of the books, I mean, like Ruth, for instance, we put it in our Bibles in the Protestant Christian order, typically between Judges and Samuel, because that's where it fits chronologically. But it seems like that was a book where its contribution to the canon, the reason it was accepted, even though it may have been written outside of the unit of the prophets, is because it kind of fills that genealogical gap, and also still shows how someone who shows the faithfulness of Yahweh produces the Exodus-giving Messiah figure later in life, just by showing faithfulness that echoes and mirrors Yahweh's faithfulness. So.
Right. Well, and doesn't the beginning of Ruth start with in the time of the judges? Yeah. And so it makes sense that it comes right after.
Yeah, if you were going to sit down yourself and just like reorder all these, it makes sense to put it there.
Absolutely.
But it makes a contribution that is worth having in there, even though it wasn't written as part of that original story.
Right.
It's kind of filling a gap, but it's doing it in such a good way that, it's reasonable to see it as inspired and carrying forward that tradition of the Torah.
Right.
Same thing with like Lamentations being paired with Jeremiah, because, Jeremiah is talking about all this destruction coming, and then Lamentations gives this, again, a lament over the destruction that has happened in such a way that it echoes the prophets over and over and points us towards, again, the hope of Yahweh coming in the end.
Yes.
Maybe we can go through the rest of these at some point. I kind of want to do it right now, but...
Yeah, let's go through them all.
All right. So, all right, we talked about the Psalms as kind of separate. So we've already talked about Ruth. We talked about Lamentations, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. That kind of leaves Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, and Daniel to talk about. So let's talk about those. That's actually not that many books. We can definitely get through that. We're talking about high level. We just want to talk about what is their contribution to the canon. I really wish I would have went and referenced Stephen Dempster's Dominion and Dynasty before doing this, but here we go.
You just did.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Check out his book, because he actually goes through, and in his judgment, he goes through and shows what the contribution of each book is to the canon within the overall framework of the Hebrew Bible, and kind of exemplifies a canonical approach to reading your Bibles. So it's really good. Actually, that's something we should talk about too. What does this say about the canonical approach?
What is the canonical approach?
Let's come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
Okay. And again, I haven't done a deep dive into all these books, so again, this is really high level, but Proverbs, again, is just traditional wisdom that is in accord with living righteously in a Yahwistic style, and it also points us towards what is true wisdom, which is fear of the Lord. That is a constant refrain, and so again, this points us towards trust in the Lord as ultimate, and also here's some good ways to live. And that also kind of makes sense of why, like, not all of it is from Solomon. We even have some Proverbs from Egyptian kings, because, well, it's just a good idea. It's just plain good advice.
Yeah. So how do we live in light of what the Torah teaches?
Right. And so that's why it's like if there's a proverb in our culture that is from our culture, but it's good advice, sure, use it.
Right.
If it helps you, live more like what Jesus embodies and exemplifies. Job is fun. So that one's, it's a really challenging book for a lot of people, but I think, yes, it's not a theodicy, but it starts off with this righteous character. First of all, who's Job written to? Or who is reading Job for the first time?
That's a great question.
Well, okay.
I would say it's written to the Israelites.
Yes.
But that's
what period?
cop-out.
It is a cop-out, yeah. I'm not talking about like a specific person or specific group. Basically the time period.
Oh,
so a lot of people
think it's really old, but it's not as old as
the only reason
some
they say
of the
it's
other.
old is because, well, this was back before there was a covenant, obviously, because there's a Gentile who's believing. It's kind of set back in this, it seems like, again, pre-covenant period, Abrahamic kind of period. So obviously this must be back in the Abrahamic period. However, there are a lot of echoes in Job from the prophets, a lot. And it especially echoes Job's suffering is put somewhat on parallel with the Israelites' suffering in exile and destruction. And so you have this book that I think is written, again, after the exile, and there's this guy going through exilic suffering. He's a righteous guy, so he's what Israel was supposed to be, but wasn't, and he's even better than them, and he's still going through this same exilic type suffering and trying to make sense of it. I think Israel probably is wrestling with the same questions in their exile.
Right.
And then you have him, he is just like Adam. He is tested because of the questioning of the accuser or the serpent. It's going to end up being the same figure. I really recommend Robert Fayol's book, Now My Eyes Have Seen You, Images of Creation and Evil in the Book of Job. Really good book. Kind of clunky to read, but really good book. And anyway, so you get this righteous character who he goes through this exilic suffering, almost this like near-death experience kind of thing, and then he passes the test, so that's really significant. He passes the test and then is exalted to become a priest for his friends to intercede for them, and then all of his fortunes are restored. And so he kind of has this messianic trope as someone who is tested, passes, exalted to this priestly status, and kind of has this almost Garden of Eden fruitfulness with his new children and abundance kind of thing going on. And there's this really cool interlude in the middle of the book about how humans are really good at mining stuff, and we can pull all sorts of ores out of the ground, but we can't mine wisdom. We can't find it. God alone knows where it is. And he has related to us and shown us what wisdom is by saying the fear of the Lord is the end of all wisdom. And so I think that's like chapters 28 to 30, somewhere in there. And so you get this same refrain that to trust in God is ultimate wisdom. And then you also have this messianic trope of this character. It also leaves us with these two mythological chaos creatures that God is going to defeat. It leaves us with the hope of God is going to defeat the serpent. So in your suffering, God's going to destroy chaos. So lots of things in Job. I like Job.
Yeah, Job's a good book. All right, what's the next one?
Song of Songs. So that one, again, debate over that one. That's fun. It could be just, a random erotic love song that finds its way into the Hebrew Bible, or I'm kind of predisposed not entirely towards the allegorical interpretation of this being Christ and the church. I think ultimately it might kind of get you there. And the reason I say that is because of the use of the term mystery in Ephesians 5 that we're going to talk about, and also what I've kind of talked about in Through the Waters as well. So it seems like the Torah and prophets, and then also later in the New Testament, the covenant between Israel and God at Sinai is framed as a marriage. And again, you can go listen to some of our episodes on the creation of woman. We talk about that a little bit. Again, if not, go read Through the Waters. But Paul sees the covenant between Yahweh and Israel as a marriage, and the archetype of marriage is found in Genesis chapter 2. Or 1 and 2. So throughout the Bible, that's why Israel is portrayed, especially in the prophets, Israel is portrayed as the wife of Yahweh. And so you kind of have this book with a lot of poetry about this ideal marriage situation, love situation. And so I think it is probably supposed to, I had to take a deeper dive on this book, admittedly, but it's trying to portray aspects of Yahweh and Israel's relationship.
Yeah, I'm on the fence with it. I definitely see there's a pattern there that Paul says very clearly that we're meant to see marriage as a reflection of Christ and the church. And so, I struggle with the word allegory, I guess.
Yeah.
And
it gets
maybe this is just adding to the pattern or the type that ultimately gets fulfilled with Christ and the church.
Yeah, I think it might be more of like a commentary on Israel and God's relationship through the marriage metaphor, which happens again in the prophets over and over, and that's maybe why this book was used.
Right.
I think it's more than just a love song between Israel's king and one of his brides.
Right.
And yes, maybe it could instruct on some marital principles, but I think that it has more of a typological focus in that, which ultimately does get you to Christ and the church, but it's not what Origen was doing and allegorizing everything.
And I guess that's where I have a problem with some of the interpretations that really try to allegorize every little thing, every little detail. And I mean that happens throughout the Old Testament. The 5 stones of David mean these 5 things. Yeah, there's all sorts of crazy things that people come up with.
Yeah. Maybe take it all on its own terms. Don't try to allegorize everything.
Right.
But yeah. Okay, so then you have Ecclesiastes, which is, again, a very cynical type of book, trying to prod you into wisdom, taking a look at wisdom from another aspect, and even asking questions that are idealized in Proverbs. Another look and focus at wisdom from a new aspect, and again, bringing us back to the fear of the Lord, especially with like the little break-in from this narrator at the end. Like, you've heard the teachings of the teacher, now what are you going to do? And so it's kind of, again, look at all his pessimism, and he's right about some of it, so he's trying to prod you into the right direction. Daniel, again, he's taking a look at the rebellion of Israel even after the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah said, you guys are going to be in exile for 70 years because of this rebellion. Well, you've been just as rebellious in the time of Daniel, and so that discipline times 7 principle you find in Leviticus, that is now being enacted in 70 times 7 in Daniel, and that's essentially a lot of the thrust behind his message, is another prophecy of hope and judgment to a new generation who is continuing to be rebellious, and also some further hope about okay, now you've seen all these kingdoms coming, and don't worry, God is still going to destroy Leviathan like we talked about in Job. And so, again, a lot going on in each one of these books, but that's something going on there. Yeah, that covers all the books of the writings. We've talked about all the books of the writings. So
I think it's helpful to walk through those and see what they do contribute. Even though they don't necessarily introduce a new doctrine like we talked about, they do develop and clarify and help us better understand the doctrines that are introduced in the Torah. Yeah,
they do. And yeah, I'll just add this caveat though. I did not do a deep dive into all these books before this. We did this off the cuff. And so, that's why it's so high level. Overall, I think that's what these books are doing in the canon. If you have some quibbles about some of the things that I nuanced in these books, oh well, sorry. Maybe I'll go back and read a commentary later and come back and correct something. All right, so with that, let's jump back into some questions on the writings. We've got, I think, maybe 1 or 2 more to go through. So any more questions?
So next question. So can the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms refer also to the Torah, the prophets, and the writings?
Yeah, and that is a line that is taken up by a lot of scholars who want to see the Torah, prophets, and writings as the whole Hebrew Bible fixed in the 2nd century BCE, before the time of Christ. Again, it is possible, but you just can't get there with the data that we lack, pretty much. It'd be nice if that were the case, because you see, just like you have in Ben Sira, you have a reference to the law, the prophets, and the writings, and so, the other writings. And so you could have this reference to the tripartite division of the Hebrew Bible. You could also have, again, he has the law, the prophets, and these other writings that are out here that are kind of not a fixed group. So he doesn't give us a canon list. We just don't have the data to say that the Torah, prophets, and Psalms that shows up, say, in Luke, for instance, encompasses all of the 3 divided sections of the modern Hebrew Bible. Maybe we just don't have the data. And so that's why I've avoided equating the writings with the group of the Psalms. All right, with that, I think we've gone over some good questions that, again, orient us around the writings and fill in some gaps that I didn't get to address last time. Also, again, from a very high level, tried to just show, why might it be that these books were included in the canon? What contribution do they make to the hopes of the Torah in a new political situation or a new genre or something like that, to help us flesh out the truths of the Torah? So we'll come back next time and start talking about the question of, do we have the right Hebrew Bible?
Sounds like a plan.